Hey Pat, I decided to record one of my reflections as an interview with my brother, Harlan. I drafted a few questions but didn't really formulate the answers as I was going along. They were just questions that are coming up. And so you're going to get a peek into me answering them in real time. I can also write more after this if that would fulfill the reflection requirement, but we're going to see how this goes. Okay.
Great. All right, Owen. Can you describe your general work week?
Okay, yeah. Simple introductory question. So my internship runs 2 days a week, 10 to 6, but I do kind of extra schedule work throughout the week. Say scheduling clients on Mondays or Thursdays or Fridays. I do other trainings. I do staff meetings. So I have the days that I'm in the office, but I do work throughout the week, and I also do per diem work for the center. That's how I got involved there before I became an intern. I'm the TGNC peer outreach specialist for the Center Recovery Program. So I do other outreach work, plus, what's required in my internship between record keeping, trainings, meetings, facilitation, group facilitation, and individual counseling.
Wait. I know that you fulfill multiple roles at the center. What have you been doing for each?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it's interesting. Before I started at the center directly before COVID hit, I was only in the building for maybe a month, if even that, and I was hired on as the second staff person for the kind of like TGNC care coordination. So I was hired as an outreach specialist on a really limited basis. And, in a sense, we had a little bit of free reign to say, like, what do we think TGNC outreach comprises, which was really interesting, but then had to kind of fit it into, center recovery's missions, the center's missions, and like their grant, holders' interests and stuff. So as the outreach specialist, I did some like kind of really basic tabling and like event tabling. I was going to be at each Pride event throughout June for all the boroughs. Obviously, that didn't go down, but I've done just like community like organizing of resources. I think has been the main thing I've been doing, and outreach calls to anybody who is just brought to my attention for one reason or another, whether it's in the community or through the center. People who are identified as TGNC and are seeking recovery of some sort. And so my main project, and it remains my main project for the outreach component, is building a resource. Well, first, I co-authored a competency training for outside facilities, so like any level of care from outpatient to inpatient to residential to detox, like a battery of questions to assess how competent they are to work well with trans and non-binary people. And so I just actually last week started finally like doing my initial phone calls, and it was very illuminating. But that's an ongoing project that I can only devote a small amount of hours to. So that's the one role, and then the other role as the behavioral health intern is kind of growing in my clinical skills, gaining like a growing caseload. I can have up to 8 to 10 clients as an intern. I have 2 currently, and then just like doing more and more of the things. So more record keeping, more reporting to the grants. I'll eventually be doing intakes myself. Just an increasing load of clinical work and like administrative work, plus the groups that I facilitate. So I facilitate a drop-in like community group for TGNC folks that embraces any approach to recovery, from harm reduction to abstinence to just like, I think I may have a problem. And then I run a closed group called TGNC in Recovery for abstinence clients that are enrolled in our program. And then I co-facilitate an early recovery group for people who are in their first 90 days of abstinence based on something called the Matrix model.
That's quite a bit. You primarily work with T, G, and C clients. What do you think is valuable about that type of engagement? Are there any downsides?
Well, thanks for this question, Harlan. Yeah, I would say it's interesting. It's a push and pull of like absolutely what I want to be doing, and then a curiosity about the like administrative standpoint on my existence there, my role. Like I'll be clear. Like I'm the only trans person on the adult recovery team. I am the one who runs the trans groups, and as of now, I've only ever been assigned trans clients. Now, I do think that's really valuable. At the same time, I wonder what the motivations of my like clinical supervision team are. Yeah, it's complicated, but I do think there is something incredibly valuable about trans people working with trans people, and that's been reflected to me from the clients. They say, how important it's been to work directly with a trans clinician, because most of the people in that program are cis people, and most of the clinicians are cis people. there's me, and then on the youth side, there's one trans person. So super valuable. We talk about things that just would never come up in the other groups. We do a lot of focus on gender identity and how that overlaps with addiction. A lot on dysphoria, a lot about medicalization, a lot about how we navigate systems. I don't think that the participants could reach the level of openness that they do if it weren't me or another trans clinician sitting in front of them. And I think I also ask questions that other clinicians might not occur to them because they are not living this life. So I don't know, it creates a really special, unique recovery place that honestly doesn't exist many other places. The downside I think is the lack of transparency, kind of in the bureaucracy or politically or whatever. I don't know what motivates the choices made at the center about who they place with certain clinicians. There's the value of it, and then there's also the like same with same movement that like, I don't know. I wish there were a clearer sense of how they make their decisions. But honestly, like working with TGNC clients is my jam. So I'm not mad at it.
Nice. What have you noticed happening between the pandemic, the uprising for Black Lives, and the coming election?
That's a big question. Well, let's say this. The pandemic changed the face of everything, obviously, but changed the face of how you can engage in recovery. This is an outpatient program, so it moved all to virtually. There was no chance that we would stay open as a physical space, which is okay. But that has affected who can access the program, how people hear about the program, who can really engage well with the groups or counseling. Let's say that they are houseless, and usually they might come to the center quite regularly. And part of them being so much of in that landscape, they would end up in the groups, every day. They would end up making their counseling appointments or whatever. And now it's like, hopefully they have a phone and they can maybe call into this, whatever. But it's been hard. It has been hard, and because of the protocols, they haven't been able to reach a consensus and launch an idea of how outreach will continue. So we aren't doing like physical outreach in any sense, and there's no clear plan for like virtual outreach either. It's kind of just like, oh, that's a new frontier. We have no idea what that means to some extent. They did launch a really relatively successful, like Instagram advertising campaign that got new intakes, but it's been pretty touch and go. So those are some ways the pandemic has affected things. I think we also, like as evidenced by taking me on and somebody else who was hired right before me, they were expanding their services, and how much money they were willing to invest in reaching other parts of our community. The LGBT Center is often criticized for basically being an LGBT center, and more like a G center. And it's still called, they still have their historic, say, website, gaycenter.org. So they were doing, concerted outreach to outer boroughs and to DGNC people, limited but focused, and that kind of got obliterated as soon as COVID happened. And so my energies have been put elsewhere. The person who does outreach to outer boroughs has kind of been put towards other, like her energies have been put towards other things, just keep the program afloat. And the pandemic has affected the direction I think the center was going in, like a good direction the center was going in. Now the uprising has, it affected people all summer. It's still going on, but I think especially hot spotted over the summer. And I would say notably our program has few people of color versus, the main clientele, which I would say is white cis gay men. But I think there were some growing tensions and but also the space to speak about how the center underserves populations of color. But also, clients showing up and being like, this is not the time that I want to sit in a room full of white men. And that being real. We only have one group specifically for clients of color, called In Living Color, and a whole roster of white clinicians. So it's been an issue. The center itself has started doing, they had founded a racial equity steering committee, and then that got really mobilized this summer, and they've been doing all sorts of feedback groups. They have a group specifically only for white clinicians to read and learn and reflect, and then they have other groups for only black staff members, and then for other staff members of color. They have an outside agency assessing their racial equity, where they are, what they say about their mission, and then how they're actually operationalizing their mission and where they're falling short. So they're in this long process of self-assessment. I'm really interested to see how that bears out. As an intern, I am not allowed to be pulled into many conversations, and as a part-time per diem worker in my other role, I still don't get pulled into many conversations, so I've only been able to interact with that pretty minimally. Although I've advocated to be able to sit at the table. That's been an interesting, very present current the whole time we've been virtual. The election coming up. We can't get into very triggering topics in group settings. That's that's a rule. That's baseline. We don't dig into our war stories. We don't dig in deeply into trauma. We also don't get too far into, say, our political beliefs or religious beliefs, so as not to impact other group members and the sanctity of that space. We can, of course, go in individually. I haven't personally actually encountered with my clients a little bit of anxiety, but the center itself is preparing for whatever, a worst case scenario, let's say. And so we have a crisis support team, and then I think some other supports that are going to be in place, just mental health supports. I think, voting day, the center gave the staff off, so I'm not running a group that night, and I normally would be. And I kind of I thought I was going to be, and that's okay. I'll be running a group the next night, but I don't see how whatever happens. I don't know when we'll get the results. Whenever my next groups are, so there would be like kind of reflecting on maybe what that process was, this voting, how we're feeling. But I can't imagine it's not going to make its way into groups at least a little bit, and it'll be a really interesting exercise in facilitation to guide what goes on. Of course, you're imagining the worst could be, the Trump-Pence bill, them coming through. And I haven't really thought about how I'm going to deal with that. But the center itself is very aware of how this impacts the community it serves. So they're definitely making preparations for, whatever might go down. And it's not like Biden-Harris is like, the most exciting thing for our community. So there will still be feelings if that is what happens. Yeah, it's an interesting time with like the nexus of like three kind of really major things intertwining. I think really the nexus is like race, but they're all coming together. And then at the same time, you're trying to like support someone from just like surviving through their addiction that is influenced by all these other like larger monumental apocalyptic feeling things going on. It's been an interesting time to start an internship.
No doubt.
Yeah.
All right, last question. How do you see this internship informing your future study and work?
I think this is actually a really important internship for me, and it's like it in a really just practical way is providing me like what I need as far as the state is concerned, as far as like my professional credentials go. But it's really giving me this incredibly valuable experience. If I want to continue being a clinician, it's been invaluable, figuring out how to facilitate, figuring out how to counsel. And like I have training, but there's a big difference between theory and praxis. Like it is totally different when you're actually in front of somebody. And it's really helpful to reflect with my clinical supervisor. I get some insight into like their financials. The longer I remain there, they have some transparency around it, and then I'm starting to get a sense of like where their money comes from. All this reporting I have to do to grant sources, and that's interesting. For me, it's helpful if I continue to be a direct service professional, which seems to be the way I'm going. I've historically studied, maybe in more traditional settings, like in my old school, social service or like health service work. And I could see using everything I'm doing there to really build a career of some sort. I am in a very niche position actually with, working with TGNC people. And I'm learning, this is both my like clinical, critical kind of academic lens and my critical professional lens of like what we need, like what we need to think about deeply. So I say maybe academically that's, socioculturally or whatever, biopolitically, what interests me. And then in a professional sense, like there are so many gaps that could be filled. I could imagine, that competency training, for example, is like a tool to figure out a lot of information will be learned. So I'm learning a lot about what the needs are of my community and where I could possibly like really be of great service, if that's where I want to go in. My training is in substance use, but I have a great interest in TGNC people, in people experiencing addiction, and my former studies were in gerontology, and that's still of interest to me too. And I think I could see like going in one direction for a while and then dipping into my other interests for a while, and like I have a lot to work with from just clinical experience at this internship. Take away the kind of like niche factors. I'm learning a lot experientially. which is important and anxiety provoking. But it's been really good. And I think what also helps is that I'm in a really supportive environment. My colleagues are amazing. It has been nothing but a positive experience. I'll say 90%. So that's been really helpful and new. Like my previous social service experience was a lot less positive, and I'm glad to experience that that's not always the case. So yeah, and I also think it's been really valuable to work there at a time when so much, big stuff is happening. So I'm like in real time watching an organization, a historic organization, figure out how to grow and change itself, hopefully. So having a front row seat of that, I think, is a very topical thing, but I'm really glad it's kind of where I ended up there. Yeah. Does that answer all your questions?
That answers all my questions today. Thank you
so.
for reflecting for me.
Thank you. All right, Pat. Hopefully that fulfills one reflection, but we can talk about it. I hope you're well.